Lena sat quietly in her dimly lit room, the soft light from the window casting shadows on the walls. She stared out into the yard, where the golden leaves fell lazily to the ground, much like the memories of a past she had never truly escaped. Every time she saw autumn, Lena was reminded of her mother, of the years filled with emotional absence and the lack of affection that had shaped her life. She was an adult now, but the feeling of never being fully loved still haunted her, dating back to her childhood. Lena grew up in a family full of expectations. Her mother was always the strong, stern woman who demanded perfection in everything. But none of that ever made Lena feel loved. She always felt like she had to prove herself worthy of her mother's affection. But no matter what she did, it was never enough. She remembered standing in front of the mirror asking herself, "Am I good enough? Is my mother proud of me?" These questions never seemed to have an answer. The truth was, her mother always had an invisible wall between them, a distance that Lena could never break through, no matter how hard she tried. Lena had worked hard all these years to break free from the shadow of her mother, to find herself. But every time she thought she had made progress, everything fell apart. Her relationships were unsuccessful, and the feeling of emptiness and lack of love always returned. She began to realize that every issue in her life stemmed from the emotional wounds of her past, wounds she had never fully confronted. So, who is really holding me back, Lena wondered. It wasn't just her mother or her family. It was the image of her mother in her mind that kept her trapped. It wasn't her mother causing all the pain, but the way Lena had internalized her. Lena had tried to run from her past, but she couldn't outrun herself. The truth was, she had spent her life trying to meet impossible standards, and in doing so, she had never given herself the love and compassion she so desperately needed. Now, she faced the hard reality. In order to move forward, she had to face those wounds. At that moment, something shifted inside her. Lena realized she could no longer live in this cycle of self-doubt. She had to confront the past, and not by blaming her mother, but by acknowledging that her emotional wounds were hers to heal, and only hers. Lena felt a wave of emotions crash over her, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. It wasn't a complete sense of freedom yet, but it was a first turning point on her journey. She could see that the real change would come from within her. She had to stop waiting for someone else to heal her. She had to start with herself. She stood up, looking out the window, the wind carrying the last of the leaves away. Lena knew it wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she was ready to take the first step. It wasn't going to be a smooth journey, but it would be hers. And that was all that mattered. Lena woke up to a new day, the morning light filtering softly through her curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. But something had changed inside her. The night before, after sitting with her thoughts for hours, she had come to a realization. She no longer wanted to be a prisoner of her past. The realization was sharp, almost painful, but liberating at the same time. For years, Lena had been living for others, seeking validation from her mother, trying to meet expectations she had never agreed to. But now, she could no longer ignore the truth. She had been stuck in a cycle of dependency, not just on her mother, but on the idea of being saved by someone or something. She was waiting for a rescue that would never come. It was time to stop waiting. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. It was one thing to acknowledge the problem, but another to actively work on it. The weight of change felt overwhelming at times. The fear of stepping away from the familiar was real. After all, for most of her life, Lena had been living to meet the expectations of others. And now, to break free, she would have to face something even more terrifying: herself. The first step was acceptance. Lena understood that to heal, she had to stop seeking approval from others. She had spent too much time looking for validation outside of herself, from a mother who could never truly give her the love she needed, from relationships that only left her more drained and empty. Lena began to understand that her emotional wounds were not a reflection of the world around her. They were the result of the story she had told herself for so long: that she wasn't good enough, that she wasn't worthy of unconditional love, and that lie had controlled her for years. It took time, but Lena finally started to let go of the idea that someone else had to heal her. She didn't need anyone else's validation to be whole. She had to give herself the permission to be imperfect, to be flawed. It was one of the hardest things she'd ever done, but every day it became a little easier. The more Lena focused on her own needs, the more she realized how much she had neglected herself. She began taking care of her body, both physically and emotionally. She started to write in a journal every morning, jotting down her thoughts and feelings, letting them flow freely without judgment. She took time to meditate, to connect with her inner self in ways she had never allowed herself to before. These small acts of self-care started to make a big difference. But letting go of dependency wasn't just about self-care. It was also about setting boundaries. Lena had always been the one to give too much, to sacrifice her own needs for the sake of others. She had to learn how to say no. And that was one of the hardest lessons of all. Saying no meant that she was finally putting herself first. It meant she was breaking the cycle of emotional neglect. Lena found that each time she said no, she felt a little stronger, a little more empowered. She wasn't letting others take more from her than she was willing to give. She wasn't letting the weight of others' expectations control her. There were times when Lena felt like giving up. She'd catch herself slipping into old patterns, doubting herself, fearing rejection, needing approval. But each time, she remembered what she had learned. Healing was a process, not a destination. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to keep moving forward. It wasn't long before Lena started noticing changes in herself. She felt less anxious, less needy. She didn't feel like she had to perform or prove herself to others. She found a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. One day, as Lena sat by the window, looking at the changing leaves outside, she realized how far she had come. She was no longer the person who had to seek validation from others. She was no longer the person who was defined by her past. She had finally let go of the dependency that had held her captive for so long. Lena smiled softly to herself. She wasn't perfect, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was enough. She was enough just as she was. Lena woke up that morning feeling different. There was a heaviness in the air, like the weight of something she had been avoiding for far too long was finally coming to the surface. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was something deep inside her, something raw and unspoken. She could feel it stirring in her chest, a storm of emotions ready to break free. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly. Her mind raced with memories of her childhood, those fleeting moments with her mother, the smiles that never reached her eyes, the love that always felt conditional. Lena had spent so many years trying to move on, trying to heal from the wounds that had been left behind. But today she realized the healing wasn't going to happen just by ignoring the pain. It was going to require facing it head on. The truth was, Lena had been running for so long, running from the hurt, the rejection, the deep-seated feeling that she was never enough. Every time she thought she was past it, those feelings would return, creeping back into her life like an unwelcome guest. Today, those feelings felt overwhelming, like a flood of emotions threatening to drown her. Lena stood up, walking over to the window, looking out at the world outside. It was a beautiful day, but inside her the storm was raging. She had spent so much time trying to convince herself that everything was okay. But now, as she took a deep breath, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The past was still with her, buried deep within her heart. She had spent years blaming her mother for her pain, for the emotional neglect, for the absence of affection that had shaped her childhood. But Lena now realized that it wasn't just her mother who had caused the pain. It was the story she had been telling herself, the belief that she wasn't worthy of love, that she had to earn it, that she had to be perfect to deserve it. Tears welled up in Lena's eyes as she thought about the time she had spent waiting for her mother's approval, for her mother's love, but it had never come. And yet, Lena had carried that longing with her into adulthood, seeking validation in every relationship, in every encounter. The truth was, she had never given herself the love and validation she needed. She had been waiting for someone else to fill the void inside her, never realizing that the only person who could do that was herself. As the tears began to fall, Lena felt the weight of her grief, her anger, and her frustration all at once. She cried for the little girl who had been abandoned emotionally, for the young woman who had spent years chasing after love and approval that never came. She cried for the broken pieces of herself that had been scattered over the years, for the pain that had been buried deep within her. But as she cried, something shifted. The storm inside her wasn't just destructive, it was also a release. For the first time, Lena allowed herself to feel everything she had been suppressing for so long. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't trying to hide from the pain. She was letting it come to the surface, letting it wash over her and take her somewhere new. Lena sat down on the floor, her hands pressed to her face as the tears continued to flow. It wasn't easy to face these emotions. There was so much pain, so much anger, so much sadness. But in that moment, Lena realized that this was the only way forward. She couldn't continue to live her life trying to outrun her past. She had to confront it, accept it, and let it go. The storm didn't last forever, but it was necessary. Lena knew that in order to heal, she had to allow herself to feel the pain, the hurt, and the anger. She had to release the emotions that had been trapped inside her for so long. And as the storm slowly subsided, a new clarity emerged. She wasn't the victim of her past anymore. She was in control of her future. When the tears finally stopped, Lena looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was swollen, her eyes red, but there was a new light in her eyes, a light that hadn't been there before. For the first time, she saw herself clearly. She wasn't broken. She wasn't the sum of her past mistakes. She was a woman who had endured, who had survived, and who was finally ready to thrive. The storm of emotions had passed, but Lena knew it wasn't the end. It was just another step on her journey. She wasn't healed yet, but she was on her way. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt a sense of peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding pain, but the kind of peace that comes from embracing it and moving through it. Lena woke up, feeling a quiet shift in the air. The storm inside her had subsided, but the calm that followed felt different. It wasn't the calm of avoidance or denial, but the calm that comes from finally accepting yourself. The tears from the night before had cleared away the heavy fog that had clouded her mind for so long. She had faced the rawness of her pain, and in doing so, she had begun to see the world and herself in a new light. As she sat on her bed, Lena took a deep breath and looked around her room. It felt like a different space now, one she could finally breathe in. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from herself. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't or trying to meet impossible standards. She was simply Lena, and that was enough. The truth was, Lena had spent so much of her life searching for something outside of herself to fill the emptiness inside her. She had longed for her mother's love, for validation in her relationships, for approval from others. But what she had failed to realize was that everything she needed to heal and feel whole was already within her. The love she had been searching for wasn't something she needed to receive. It was something she needed to give herself. Lena's journey towards self-love hadn't been easy. There were still days when the old doubts crept in, when she questioned whether she was enough. But those days were fewer now. Each time those thoughts resurfaced, Lena reminded herself of the truth. She was worthy of love, not because of what she did or didn't do, but simply because she existed. It wasn't just about affirmations or self-help advice. It was about the small, everyday choices that showed love and compassion for herself. It was about giving herself permission to rest when she was tired, to say no when something didn't feel right, and to embrace her imperfections without judgment. These were the acts of self-love that had been foreign to her for so long, but now they were becoming second nature. Lena stood up and walked to the mirror. She looked at herself, not with criticism, but with acceptance. She didn't see the girl who had spent years trying to be perfect. She didn't see the broken pieces of the past. She saw a woman who had been through the storm and come out on the other side, stronger and more self-aware. She smiled at her reflection. It wasn't a smile of perfection, but one of genuine self-acceptance. She no longer felt the need to hide behind masks or to constantly prove her worth. She was enough, and that realization felt like freedom. Freedom from the expectations that had held her back for so long. Freedom from the emotional prison she had built around herself. Lena didn't need anyone else to define her anymore. She didn't need approval or validation from the outside world. She had learned to be her own source of love, to fill the empty spaces inside her with kindness, compassion, and understanding. She was no longer seeking something to heal her. She had become the healer. It was a quiet kind of freedom, one that didn't need to be announced to the world. It was the freedom of knowing that she had the power to shape her own reality. She didn't have to repeat the patterns of the past or live in the shadow of her mother's expectations. She was free to live her life on her own terms. Lena knew the journey was far from over. Healing wasn't a destination. And self-love wasn't something that happened overnight. But for the first time, she felt at peace with where she was. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to keep choosing herself every day, in every moment. As she stepped away from the mirror, Lena felt lighter, freer, more present in her own life. She knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them. Because now, she understood something that she hadn't before. Freedom begins when you stop seeking approval from others and start giving it to yourself.